It was a quiet afternoon in a small, bustling neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the streets. People were going about their business, some heading home after a long day, others stopping by the local store for a quick purchase. Among them, moving through the crowd, was Agent Michelle Carter, a dedicated FBI agent on a routine surveillance mission. She was dressed casually, blending in with the crowd, but her mind was focused. Michelle's assignment wasn't unusual. She had been sent to observe a few leads in the area, an assignment that required her to stay unnoticed. As an experienced agent, Michelle knew how to keep a low profile and avoid drawing attention to herself. What she didn't expect was to encounter a person who would cause her unnecessary trouble. Walking down the street, Michelle noticed a police car pull up beside her. The officer inside, a man in his mid-30s with a harsh, unwelcoming face, was clearly looking for someone to challenge. Michelle kept walking, minding her business, but the officer's gaze stayed fixed on her. "Hey, stop right there," the officer called out, stepping out of the car. Michelle hesitated, but then calmly turned to face him. The officer's tone was aggressive, and his eyes showed no sign of trust. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, looking her up and down. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood." Michelle took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. She had dealt with situations like this before, people assuming things about her based on her appearance. But this time was different. She had to keep her cover, as revealing her true identity would risk the entire investigation. "I'm just passing through," she answered quietly, trying to defuse the situation. But the officer wasn't listening. His expression turned sour, and his voice grew sharper. "Just passing through, huh? Well, I've never seen you around here before. You must be up to something. I don't like people wandering where they don't belong." Michelle felt the weight of his accusation, but she didn't let it show. She knew that challenging him would only escalate things. She stayed quiet, hoping that he would let her go on her way. But the officer seemed intent on making a scene. "You think I'm just going to let you go without checking you out?" the officer continued, his eyes narrowing. "Get in the car." Michelle's heart raced, but she knew what she had to do. She had to stay calm and not give away her identity. She was a federal agent, but this cop didn't know that. If she said too much, it could endanger everything she had worked for. So she did as he said. She got in the car, trying to keep her composure while the officer drove her to the local precinct. The entire situation felt surreal. Michelle had faced discrimination before, but it never failed to shock her when it came from someone who should have been upholding the law. She couldn't believe that in this day and age, a simple walk down the street could turn into an unjustified arrest. As the car drove to the station, Michelle knew this was only the beginning of what could be a long and difficult road ahead. But she also knew she was strong enough to handle whatever came next. As Michelle sat quietly in the back of the police car, her mind raced. She was trying to figure out how to get out of this situation without drawing attention to herself. The officer driving had barely said a word since he told her to get in the car. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, and his eyes flickered to the rearview mirror every few seconds. It was clear that he had made up his mind about her. And now, it was just a matter of carrying out whatever he had decided. The ride to the local precinct felt like it took forever. Michelle's thoughts bounced from one thing to the next, trying to predict what might happen next. What would she do when they arrived? How could she handle this without revealing her true identity? The officer's actions grew increasingly erratic as they neared the station. He took sharp turns, driving faster than usual. Michelle could tell he was trying to act tough. It was as if he enjoyed the power he had over her, even though he had no real reason to stop her in the first place. When they finally arrived at the station, the officer stopped the car abruptly. He turned to look at her with a smirk. "Out of the car," he ordered. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. She was hoping for a quick release, but as she walked toward the building, the officer grabbed her arm firmly and led her inside. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out," he said, pushing open the door with his shoulder. Inside, the precinct was noisy, filled with officers coming and going. It was a stark contrast to Michelle's calm demeanor. She stood still, trying not to show how unsettling the situation had become. Her thoughts were sharp, but she knew she had to keep her cool. She wasn't just a civilian. She was a trained agent, but this officer didn't know that yet. The officer walked her to a holding room in the back. Michelle noticed the way other officers looked at her, many of them unaware of the true situation. They probably saw her as just another woman being processed, someone who didn't belong. "You can sit down," the officer said, throwing a chair across the room. Michelle sat, keeping her posture straight and her expression calm. She was determined not to let fear show, no matter what this officer tried to do. She didn't want him to see her struggle, to see the stress creeping up on her. But it was hard, especially as the officer stood in the doorway, watching her. "Think you're above the law, huh?" he sneered, pacing back and forth in front of her. Michelle kept her voice even. "I'm not above the law. I'm just trying to go about my day." The officer scoffed. "I don't believe that for a second. You're probably just another criminal trying to blend in." Despite his harsh words, Michelle didn't react. She had been in worse situations, and she knew how to handle herself. But deep inside, it stung. She had never imagined that her day would turn out like this. She wasn't used to being treated like a criminal, and certainly not because of the color of her skin. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Time felt like it was dragging on, each second feeling longer than the last. But she couldn't afford to let the officer see how uncomfortable she was. She had to stay composed and trust that her colleagues would eventually find out what was happening. Meanwhile, the officer seemed to grow more impatient with every passing minute. He kept coming closer, making small talk as though trying to provoke her, but Michelle kept her responses short and controlled. She knew this wasn't the time to show any weakness. Michelle sat quietly in the holding room, her mind racing but her body still. She had been there for what felt like hours, but in truth, it had only been a short time. The officer who had arrested her was still nearby, pacing back and forth, watching her closely. He had not said much since they arrived at the station, but his eyes never left her. She could tell that the officer felt a sense of power, enjoying the discomfort he had caused. He seemed pleased with himself, as though he had done something significant by arresting her. Michelle stayed calm, though the situation was frustrating and degrading. She had been through plenty of difficult situations before, but this one was different. This one was personal. The officer leaned against the doorframe, still watching her. "You're lucky I even let you sit down," he muttered. "You should be grateful. Not many people get this kind of treatment." Michelle didn't respond. There was nothing to say that would make a difference. She had dealt with men like him before, people who believed that they could control others simply because of their position. But this time, it was harder to stay silent. She was a professional, a trained agent, and yet here she was, sitting in a cold holding room, treated like a criminal for no reason at all. The officer continued with his mockery. "You probably think you're special, don't you? FBI agent or not. You're still just like the rest of them." Michelle's heart tightened, but she refused to let the officer see that. She had worked so hard to get to where she was, to become an agent, to prove that she was just as capable as anyone else. And yet here she was, being humiliated by someone who didn't even know who she truly was. She clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. "You think you're above it all, huh? Just because you're part of some fancy agency." The officer scoffed, clearly enjoying the power he thought he had. "I've seen your kind before. Always trying to act like you're better than everyone else." Michelle could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had trained for years to stay calm in high-pressure situations. She could handle this, even if it was difficult. She had to. If she let her emotions take control, she would lose the upper hand. The officer's taunts became more frequent, each one designed to chip away at her resolve. But Michelle remained silent. She had learned long ago that people like him thrived on getting a reaction. They fed on it, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. Time dragged on, and Michelle continued to sit, staring at the wall, keeping her thoughts focused. She couldn't let this situation break her. She had a mission, and she had to stay on course. Every moment she spent in that room, though degrading, was another step toward proving that she was stronger than this officer could ever understand. Eventually, the officer grew bored with his own taunts. He took a few steps away from the door and leaned against a nearby desk. "I don't know why you're even here," he muttered, his voice quieter now. "But it doesn't matter. You're going to spend some time in here, thinking about it." Michelle said nothing. She knew he would soon realize that his actions would have consequences, though he didn't know it yet. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the holding room remained tense. Michelle could hear the sounds of the police station around her. Voices echoing, the shuffle of footsteps, and the occasional clink of keys. But in the small room, it felt like she was completely isolated. She didn't speak to the officer. She didn't let him see how much his words affected her. She simply waited. The officer had left her alone for a while, and Michelle took the moment to breathe. She focused on staying calm, knowing she would need her full strength to face what was coming. It was frustrating being treated this way, but she had trained for difficult situations. She had to remind herself that the only way out of this was to stay composed. She had no idea how much time had passed when the door to the holding room finally opened. A couple of uniformed officers stepped inside. They looked at Michelle for a moment, then turned their attention to the officer who had arrested her. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, looking somewhat pleased with himself. One of the officers glanced at Michelle. "She's the one?" he asked, his voice a bit cautious. The officer who had arrested her nodded, giving her a pointed look. "Yep, caught her in the act. Doesn't belong here. Probably a criminal trying to blend in." Michelle felt a flicker of frustration, but she didn't let it show. She had been on the job long enough to know how quickly things could go wrong if she let her emotions take over. She had a job to do, and now it was time for her identity to come into play. At that moment, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a small, quiet sound, but the officer heard it too. He glanced at her phone with a sneer. "What's that? Are your criminal buddies calling you?" Michelle didn't respond. Instead, she slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She unlocked it, typing in a quick message. Then, she held the phone up for the officers to see, her thumb hovering over the screen. The officer who had arrested her stepped forward. "What's that? Some secret code you're sending?" he sneered. Michelle didn't say anything. Instead, she opened the message on her phone and handed it to the officer. The message was simple: Agent Carter reporting. Situation under control. Request backup. For a long moment, the officer stared at the phone in confusion. Then the other officers who had entered the room read the message and exchanged glances. One of them reached for his radio, a look of realization dawning on his face. "Wait a second," the officer said, his voice now more cautious. You're with the FBI." Michelle finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I'm Agent Michelle Carter. I've been undercover, investigating the area." The officer who had arrested her looked completely stunned. His eyes widened as he processed what had just happened. The smugness in his face was replaced with shock, then confusion. It was clear that he had no idea who she really was when he made the arrest. You're with the FBI?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Michelle nodded slowly. "Yes, and I suggest you get in touch with your superiors." The other officers in the room seemed taken aback. They had seen the tension earlier, but hadn't realized the full picture. Now they were beginning to understand the situation. The officer who had arrested Michelle stood frozen, his face red with embarrassment. Michelle didn't say anything more. She simply waited as the officer who had been in charge of her case walked out of the room to make a call. The other officers stayed, their eyes shifting between her and the officer who had caused this mess. As she waited, Michelle couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. The situation was far from over, but at least now the truth was out. The officer who had humiliated her would soon learn that actions had consequences, and that the power he so confidently wielded would not go unnoticed. The tension in the holding room was palpable as the officer who had arrested Michelle stood in silence, staring at her in disbelief. His earlier confidence had melted away, replaced by a mixture of shame and confusion. Michelle remained calm, her posture steady as she waited for the inevitable shift in the situation. It had taken a few moments for the other officers to fully grasp what had just happened, but now they understood. The FBI agent sitting in front of them wasn't just some random person. They had mistakenly arrested an undercover agent. Outside the room, Michelle could hear the faint buzz of radios and hurried footsteps. It wasn't long before the door opened again, and a senior officer entered, looking serious but with a hint of understanding in his eyes. "Your agent, Michelle Carter?" he asked, scanning the room and locking eyes with her. "Yes, I am," she replied, her voice steady, though her mind was already calculating the next steps. The officer nodded, signaling for the younger officers to step back. "We need to figure out exactly what happened here. I'm sure you've been through a lot, but I need your full statement." Michelle nodded, knowing that it was now time to put the pieces together. She recounted the events from the beginning, explaining how she had been conducting routine surveillance in the area and had been stopped by the officer who had wrongly assumed she was a criminal. The senior officer listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions along the way. Michelle didn't leave out any details, even though it was difficult to relive the moment when she was so unjustly treated. She spoke calmly, maintaining the professionalism that had always guided her through the toughest situations. As Michelle spoke, the officer who had arrested her stood off to the side, clearly uncomfortable. He shifted from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact with both her and the senior officer. Michelle could tell that he was trying to process what had just happened, but it was too late. The truth was already out. The senior officer turned to face the man who had arrested Michelle. "You didn't recognize her, did you?" he asked, his voice cool and professional, but with a touch of disappointment. "No, sir, I didn't," the officer stammered, his hands nervously gripping his belt. "She was acting suspicious, and you assumed she was a criminal based on her appearance." The senior officer interrupted. "That's not how we do things here. You don't get to treat people like that." The officer opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it. There was nothing he could say that would excuse his behavior. His eyes flickered over to Michelle, who still sat quietly, watching him with a calm but unwavering gaze. The senior officer gave a small nod, signaling that it was time to move forward. "We'll need to run a full investigation into this," he said, looking back at Michelle. "We'll take care of it from here. You're free to go, Agent Carter." Michelle stood up slowly, still taking in the gravity of the situation. She had been humiliated, but now it was time to turn the page. As she made her way out of the room, she could feel the weight of the officer's stare on her, but it didn't bother her anymore. It was clear that he had made a mistake, and now it was up to the higher-ups to determine the consequences. Walking out into the hallway, Michelle felt a sense of relief. The wheels were already in motion, and justice would be served. She knew that this officer's actions weren't just an isolated incident. They were part of a larger problem. But now he would have to face the consequences of his mistakes, and Michelle was confident that, in the end, the truth would come out, and he would have no choice but to answer for his actions. The next few days were a whirlwind for Michelle. After the senior officer had taken her statement, everything began moving quickly. The police station was buzzing with activity, and the officers who had been in the room during her interrogation now understood the severity of the situation. It wasn't just an ordinary mistake. The officer who had arrested her had made a serious error, and now he had to face the consequences. Michelle tried to keep her focus on her work. She knew that her role in the investigation wasn't over, even though she had already given her statement. Her colleagues in the FBI were following up on her case and working behind the scenes to ensure that the officer's actions were properly addressed. But Michelle also knew that it wasn't just about the officer's punishment. It was about making sure that this didn't happen again to anyone else. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested Michelle, Officer Brown, was beginning to feel the heat. At first, he had tried to deny that he had done anything wrong, telling himself that he had just been doing his job. But as the investigation continued, his colleagues began to distance themselves from him. The higher-ups were already involved, and it was clear that the situation was serious. Officer Brown found himself on paid leave, but that didn't make things easier. He had been called in for questioning by Internal Affairs. His once proud, confident attitude had started to crack. The more he thought about what had happened, the more he realized how badly he had messed up. He couldn't undo what he had done, and the truth was starting to sink in. One evening, Officer Brown sat alone in his apartment, replaying the events in his mind. He had assumed that Michelle was just another person he could push around. He had assumed that because of her appearance, she didn't belong in the area, that she was someone who should be treated with suspicion. But he had been wrong, and now he was paying the price. His career was on the line, and the thought of losing everything he had worked for weighed heavily on him. As the days passed, Michelle's colleagues in the FBI continued to gather evidence. They had reached out to other officers at the station to get a clearer picture of Officer Brown's behavior. It didn't take long for them to uncover a troubling pattern. He had a history of making assumptions about people based on their appearance, particularly when it came to people of color. Michelle wasn't the first person he had treated this way, and it became clear that his actions were not just a one-time mistake. The investigation revealed that Officer Brown had been involved in several other incidents of questionable behavior. He had ignored procedures, made racist comments, and used his position to intimidate others. As the evidence stacked up, it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to deny the truth. His actions were being exposed, and the consequences were beginning to unfold. One morning, Michelle received a call from her supervisor. "Agent Carter, we have an update for you," he said, his voice steady but serious. "Officer Brown is facing disciplinary action. Internal Affairs has confirmed that his actions violated several department policies and were recommending termination." Michelle took a deep breath, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. She had done everything she could to handle the situation with professionalism, and now the truth was being recognized. Officer Brown's actions had led to his downfall, and Michelle knew that this would be a lesson to others who might think they could abuse their power. As the days went on, Officer Brown's reputation crumbled. His colleagues no longer supported him, and he found himself isolated, struggling to come to terms with the fact that his actions had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Michelle continued her work with the FBI, her head held high. She had faced humiliation, but she had also shown strength and resilience. In the end, it was clear that karma had found its way to Officer Brown. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation into Officer Brown's actions continued to gather momentum. Michelle had kept her focus on her work, but she couldn't help but notice the growing whispers about Officer Brown around the station. People were talking about him, and it was clear that the higher-ups were taking the matter seriously. His once strong position in the department was slipping away, and Michelle felt a small sense of justice. The day of the big reveal finally arrived. Michelle was sitting at her desk, going over some reports, when she received a call from her supervisor. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that told her this was an important update. "Agent Carter, we've finished our investigation. Officer Brown has been formally charged with misconduct and violation of department policies. Internal Affairs has completed their review, and we're moving forward with disciplinary action. We're recommending termination." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but hearing the words confirmed everything she had worked so hard for. She had kept her head high and maintained her professionalism throughout the entire ordeal, and now it was finally paying off. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "What happens next?" "There will be a meeting tomorrow to finalize everything. You'll need to attend, but you've done your part. You can go ahead and take the rest of the day to prepare." Michelle hung up the phone, her mind swirling with a mix of emotions. Part of her wanted to feel satisfied, but she couldn't help but feel a little sad for Officer Brown. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. But this was bigger than him. It was about making sure that officers like him, who abused their power, were held accountable. The following day, Michelle attended the meeting with her colleagues and higher-ranking officers. Officer Brown was there too, but he was no longer the proud man who had arrested her. He looked smaller, defeated. His once strong stance was now a posture of shame. Michelle could see the regret in his eyes as he sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. The room was filled with silence as the evidence was presented. Michelle's testimony, along with the reports from Internal Affairs, showed the full extent of Officer Brown's behavior. He had ignored procedure, targeted people based on their race, and made assumptions about others without any evidence. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern of misconduct. As the officers and Internal Affairs representatives spoke, Michelle felt a sense of closure. This wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about holding someone accountable for actions that went against everything the police force stood for. She had been the one who was wronged. But now, the tables had turned. After the final statements were made, the senior officer in charge stood up. "Officer Brown," he said, his voice firm, but without anger, "based on the evidence and your actions, we are recommending your termination from the department. You have failed to uphold the values of this force, and your actions will not be tolerated." The room fell silent as Officer Brown stood up, his shoulders slumped. He knew this was the end of his career. His future had been decided, and there was no way to reverse it. Michelle didn't look at him. She kept her eyes focused straight ahead, knowing that the right thing had been done. Officer Brown had made a choice, and now he had to face the consequences. As Michelle walked out of the room, she felt a quiet sense of pride. She had faced humiliation, but she had also proven that justice could be served. It wasn't just about the officer. It was about setting an example for others who might think they could get away with wrongdoing. Michelle knew that her actions had made a difference, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath of Officer Brown's termination spread quickly through the station. It was a topic of conversation at every shift change, in the break rooms, and among officers who had worked with him. Many of them were shocked, but Michelle couldn't help but feel that this was a necessary step toward change. Officer Brown had been part of the problem. And now, because of his actions, the whole department would have to confront the reality of how things like bias and misconduct could affect everyone. Michelle didn't expect sympathy from anyone. She knew that many people in the station had their own opinions about what had happened. Some might think that Brown was unfairly targeted, but the evidence spoke for itself. Michelle's testimony had made it clear that his actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern. The department had to hold him accountable, and they had done so. As the days passed, Michelle focused on her work, knowing that she had done what was right. She received a few quiet nods of respect from colleagues who understood the seriousness of the situation. But for the most part, Michelle stayed in the background. She had made it through the storm, and now she could focus on her mission once again. Officer Brown's downfall wasn't just about his career. It affected everyone around him. There were whispers of other officers facing scrutiny, questioning their own actions. His mistakes had caused a ripple effect, and now, the entire department was forced to look at how they treated people, especially people of color. Michelle had hoped that his downfall would spark some positive change, even if it was just a small one. One afternoon, Michelle received an invitation to a department-wide meeting. It was scheduled by the higher-ups, and the tone of the invitation suggested that it was an important gathering. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that it had something to do with the fallout from Officer Brown's termination. When Michelle walked into the meeting room, she was greeted by the senior officer who had been in charge of the investigation. He gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement before turning to the group. The room was filled with officers, some of whom had been with the department for years. Michelle took a seat near the back, listening carefully as the senior officer began to speak. "We are all here today because of the actions of one officer," the senior officer began, his voice steady. "But we are also here because of the changes we need to make as a department. Officer Brown's actions were unacceptable, and they do not reflect the values we stand for. But this is also an opportunity for us to look inward and ask ourselves how we can do better." Michelle sat quietly, absorbing his words. She had seen this type of meeting before, where people said the right things but rarely followed through. But something felt different this time. There was a sense of honesty in the room that Michelle hadn't expected. Officers were talking about ways to improve training, address biases, and foster better relationships with the communities they served. It wasn't going to be an easy road, but it was a start. The meeting continued with discussions about new protocols, changes in how officers interacted with the public, and the introduction of bias training. Michelle wasn't sure if all of this would be enough to make lasting change, but she felt hopeful for the first time in a long while. Officer Brown's actions had forced the department to face its flaws, and now they had the chance to improve. As the meeting came to an end, the senior officer addressed the room one last time. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. It's time for us to be better, and that starts today." Michelle left the meeting feeling a sense of quiet pride. She hadn't set out to change the department, but now, it seemed like her actions had made an impact. It was a small step, but it was a step toward progress. She knew that this wouldn't be the last challenge she would face. But at least now, she felt like things were moving in the right direction. Weeks passed since Officer Brown's termination, and the dust began to settle in the department. The changes that had been promised during the meeting slowly started to take shape. There were new policies being discussed, additional training sessions being held, and a clearer focus on community relations. Michelle had no illusions that these changes would solve everything overnight, but they were a step in the right direction. She hoped that the department would continue to improve and that her experience would lead to lasting reforms. As Michelle moved forward with her own work, she could feel a change in the air. The investigation into Officer Brown had not only exposed his wrongdoings, but had also brought to light the weaknesses in the system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Now, there was a renewed focus on making things right, and for Michelle, that was the most important outcome. One day, as Michelle was heading into the office, she received a phone call from her supervisor. His voice was serious, but there was a hint of something else behind it. "Agent Carter, we have some news. Internal Affairs has completed their full investigation into Officer Brown, and it's clear that his actions weren't an isolated case," he said, pausing for a moment. "There are more officers in the department who have been involved in similar misconduct. The fallout from this case is bigger than we anticipated." Michelle felt a mixture of frustration and resolve. She had expected that Officer Brown's behavior might have been part of a larger issue, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. However, this was not a time for hesitation. The work she had done in bringing Officer Brown to justice had set a precedent. Now, it was time for the department to face the full extent of its issues. "Are we moving forward with the next steps?" she asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Absolutely. We are launching a broader investigation, and your role in this will be crucial. You've been a key part of this from the beginning, and we need your help to make sure that this kind of behavior doesn't happen again." Michelle nodded. She had always known that her work wasn't just about one individual. It was about the system as a whole. The fact that Officer Brown was just one piece of a much larger puzzle only confirmed her belief that lasting change was necessary. Over the next few weeks, Michelle continued to work closely with Internal Affairs. She helped track down additional evidence, spoke with more officers, and uncovered a pattern of discriminatory behavior that had been overlooked for far too long. It was clear now that Officer Brown's termination had been just the beginning. His actions had opened the door to a much larger investigation, and Michelle was determined to see it through. As the investigation expanded, more officers were implicated, and the department began to implement more drastic measures. Some officers were reassigned, while others faced disciplinary action. The process was long, and not everyone was happy with the changes, but the momentum was undeniable. The department was finally acknowledging the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester for far too long. One afternoon, as Michelle was wrapping up another round of interviews, her supervisor called her into his office. He looked at her with a solemn expression, but also one of respect. "Agent Carter," he began, "the changes we've made wouldn't have happened without your hard work and courage. You've set an example for all of us, and we're starting to see real progress because of it." Michelle felt a quiet sense of pride. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when she wondered if the system could ever truly change. But now, looking back at how far they had come, she knew that her actions had made a difference. Officer Brown's downfall had led to something bigger than anyone had expected, and in the end, it wasn't just about him. It was about creating a better future for everyone. As Michelle walked out of her supervisor's office, she knew that this chapter was coming to a close. There would always be challenges ahead, but she was ready. She had faced the worst, and she had come out stronger on the other side. Now it was time to move forward, knowing that the work she had done had made a real lasting impact.